I'll never forget the sound of his laughter echoing through that courtroom on that Tuesday morning. Richard sat there, pen in hand, signing those divorce papers like he was autographing a trophy. Each stroke of the pen came with a low chuckle, almost whispered, as if he was sharing a private joke with the universe. "Finally," he murmured to his lawyer loud enough for me to hear, "free from this dead weight." Dead weight. 43 years of marriage, and I was dead weight. My name is Elena, and today at 71 I know that some victories come when you least expect them. But in that moment, sitting in that hard wooden chair, my hands trembling not from nervousness but from a cold anger I'd been storing for decades, I had no idea I was about to witness the most satisfying spectacle of my entire life. Richard had always been this way, arrogant to his core. Even that day, at 68 years old, he carried himself like the king of the world. Expensive suit, silver hair perfectly styled, that predatory smile I knew so well. The same smile he used when closing another shady real estate deal, when he cheated another elderly couple out of their life savings, when he came home late reeking of cheap perfume and lies. "You won't get a single thing," he had told me just 3 weeks earlier, standing in our kitchen, well, his kitchen now, pointing that thick finger at me like I was a disobedient child. 43 years, Elena, and what do you have to show for it? You never worked a real day in your life. You lived off me like a parasite. Parasite. That's what I was to the man who had promised to love and cherish me at the altar of St. Mary's Cathedral in 1981. But here's what Richard never understood about quiet women like me. We see everything. We remember everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe decides it's time to balance the scales. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s named Judge Martinez, was reviewing the paperwork with methodical precision. Richard kept glancing at his watch, tapping his foot like he had somewhere important to be. Probably another business meeting with his 34-year-old secretary, the one he thought I didn't know about. "Mr. Castellanos," Judge Martinez said, looking up from the documents, "before we finalize this divorce decree, I need to run through some standard background checks." Richard's smile widened. "Of course, Your Honor," clean as a whistle. That's when she reached for her computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with purposeful clicks. The sound seemed to echo through the quiet courtroom like raindrops before a storm. And then her expression changed. I watched her eyebrows furrow, her lips press into a thin line. She clicked something else, leaned closer to her screen, then looked up at Richard with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Castellanos," she said slowly, "it appears we have a problem." Richard's laughter stopped mid-chuckle. For the first time in decades, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "If you're enjoying my story so far, I hope you'll stay with me as I tell you what happened next. Because what Judge Martinez discovered that day changed everything I thought I knew about the man I'd spent most of my life with." Richard's face went from confident to confused to something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. He straightened in his chair, that cocky smile finally slipping from his face like a mask someone had yanked off. "What kind of problem?" his lawyer asked, leaning forward. Judge Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving back and forth across her screen. I could hear the tick of the courthouse clock, the shuffle of papers from other tables, even the sound of Richard's breathing getting slightly heavier. "You have to understand something about my husband. Former husband. Richard Castellanos had spent our entire marriage making me feel like I was the stupid one. Every time I questioned his late nights, his mysterious phone calls, his sudden windfalls of cash that never quite added up, he would look at me with that condescending smile and say, "Elena, sweetheart, you don't understand business. Let the men handle the real work." But I understood more than he ever gave me credit for. I understood why we had 3 different bank accounts I wasn't allowed to access. I understood why he insisted on handling all our taxes himself, never letting me see the forms. I understood why he paid for everything in cash and why our successful real estate business somehow never showed much profit on paper. I understood, because I wasn't the helpless housewife he thought he'd married. Before Richard swept me off my feet in 1980, I had been 2 years into an accounting degree. But love makes you stupid sometimes, and when he promised me a life of security and comfort, I dropped out of college to become Mrs. Richard Castellanos. Biggest mistake of my life. Or so I thought. Your Honor. Richard's voice cracked slightly. I'm not sure what you think you're seeing, but I can assure you. Mr. Castellanos, Judge Martinez interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. According to this federal database, you have 17 separate IRS violations dating back to 1995. Tax evasion, unreported income, fraudulent deductions. She paused, scrolling down. The latest investigation was opened just 6 months ago. The blood drained from Richard's face so fast I thought he might faint. His lawyer immediately started whispering urgently in his ear, but Richard just sat there, staring at Judge Martinez like she was speaking a foreign language. 6 months ago, that's when he'd started talking. About divorce. That's when he suddenly became so eager to set me free from our marriage, and suddenly it all made sense. You see, there's something most people don't know about asset protection in criminal cases. When you're married, your spouse can be held liable for your debts, your crimes, your failures. But when you're divorced, when everything is legally separated, well, then only the guilty party pays the price. Richard wasn't leaving me because he'd found someone better. He was leaving me to save himself. All those years of making me feel worthless, of telling me I was nothing. Without him, of convincing me I was too stupid to survive on my own. It was all projection. He was the worthless one. He was the parasite, feeding off honest people's trust and hard-earned money. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, her voice growing harder with each word, it appears there's an active warrant for your arrest, Mr. Castellanos. The FBI has been looking for you in connection with a real estate fraud scheme that bilked elderly investors out of over $2 million. $2 million. I thought about Mrs. Henderson next door, who had trusted Richard with her late husband's pension money. I thought about the young couple down the street who had saved for years to buy their first home, only to discover the property Richard sold them didn't legally exist. I thought about my own brother Miguel, who had invested his entire retirement fund in one of Richard's guaranteed developments. All of them ruined by the man who shared my bed for 43 years. The courtroom went silent except for the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. His lawyer was frantically shuffling through papers, but even I could see there was nothing he could do. The truth has a way of catching up, doesn't it? Your Honor, Richard finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Surely we can discuss this privately. Bailiff, Judge Martinez called, her voice cutting through the air like thunder. And that's when I realized this divorce hearing was about to become something entirely different. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt, and I watched 43 years of my life collapse in real time. Not my life, his life. Because suddenly, sitting in that courtroom, I realized something profound. I had never been the one falling apart. I had been the one holding everything together while he systematically destroyed it. Richard Castellanos, the bailiff's voice boomed across the silent room. You are under arrest for federal tax evasion and real estate fraud. The sound Richard made then, it wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a man whose entire world had just crumbled. His expensive lawyer was already on his phone, probably calling whoever you call when your client gets arrested in the middle of a divorce hearing. But me? I sat perfectly still, watching the man who had called me. Worthless get handcuffed like a common criminal. And you know what I felt? Nothing. After decades of his cruelty, his condescension, his systematic campaign to make me believe I was nothing without him, I felt absolutely nothing. Elena, he called out as they started to lead him away. Elena, you have to help me. Call my broker, tell him to liquidate everything. I need bail money. I looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. This pathetic man in his expensive suit, his perfect hair now disheveled, his face pale with panic. This was the man who had convinced me I was too stupid to balance a checkbook. This was the man I had spent 4 decades trying to please. "Elena," he shouted again, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm your husband. You have to help me." I stood up slowly, my 71-year-old knees protesting slightly, and walked closer to where the bailiff held him. Richard's eyes lit up with hope. He actually thought I was going to save him. "Richard," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear, "in about 5 minutes, I won't be your wife anymore. And you know what? I think I'm going to like being Elena Vasquez again." The hope died in his eyes so fast it was almost comical. Vasquez was my maiden name, the name I'd carried before I became Mrs. Richard Castellanos, before I became his shadow. As they led him away, I heard him screaming about lawyers and phone calls and how this was all a misunderstanding. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about something else entirely. I was thinking about the woman I used to be before I met him. Elena Vasquez had been fierce once. She had plans, dreams, a backbone made of steel. She was going to be an accountant, maybe open her own practice someday. She was going to travel, learn languages, make her own money and her own decisions. But somewhere along the way, that woman got buried under layers of, "Yes, Richard," and "Of course, Richard," and "Whatever you think is best, Richard." I had become so small, so quiet, so invisible that I had almost forgotten she ever existed. Almost, but not quite. You see, there were moments over the years when the old Elena would surface, like when Richard would bring home documents for me to sign without explanation, and something deep in my gut would scream that the numbers didn't add up, or when he would get those late-night phone calls and step outside, and I would catch fragments of conversation about moving assets and keeping things off the books. I had trained myself to ignore those moments, to push them down, to trust that my husband knew better than I did. But the accountant in me never truly died. She just went underground, collecting information like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter. There was the time in 2018 when I accidentally opened his briefcase looking for aspirin and found property deeds for addresses that didn't exist. There was the Christmas party where I overheard him bragging to another realtor about how easy it was to create value out of thin air. There was the stack of cash he kept in a shoebox in our bedroom closet, $20,000, sometimes $30,000 at a time, that he claimed was just business profits. I had seen it all, heard it all, and filed it all, away in a corner of my mind where Richard couldn't reach. Because deep down, some part of me always knew this day would come. Judge Martinez turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Castellanos, given these circumstances, we'll need to postpone the final decree while we sort through the financial implications of your husband's arrest." I sat there for a moment, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades: clarity. For 43 years, I had been living in someone else's shadow, making excuses for someone else's cruelty, carrying shame that wasn't even mine. But watching Richard get led away in handcuffs, I realized something profound. I had never been the problem. I had been the solution he never deserved. "Actually, Your Honor," I said, and I swear my voice sounded different, stronger somehow, like it was coming from a place in my chest I had forgotten existed. "I'd like to speak with someone about those fraud cases. I believe I might have information that could help." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but good foreign. Like speaking a language I used to be fluent in before I forgot how powerful my own voice could be. You have to understand what this moment meant for a woman like me. For 4 decades, I had been trained to believe that speaking up was disloyal, that questioning Richard was betrayal, that my observations and instincts were worth less than his word. I had been conditioned to make myself smaller so he could feel bigger. But sitting in that courtroom watching the man who had called me worthless get arrested for being exactly that, worthless, I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me when I was young. "Mija, quiet water runs deep, but when the dam breaks, it moves mountains." You see, 43 years of Marriage teaches you things. It teaches you to notice when bank statements don't add up. It teaches you to remember names and dates and conversations your husband thinks you weren't paying attention to. It teaches you where important papers are hidden and which phone calls always happen behind. Closed doors. Richard thought I was invisible, but invisible people see everything. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Chen, arrived within the hour. She sat across from me in a small conference room, a tape recorder between us, and asked me to tell her everything I remembered about Richard's business dealings. "Mrs. Castellanos," she said gently, "I want you to understand. Cooperating with this investigation might mean testifying against your husband. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who had lost her house because she trusted Richard with her mortgage money. I thought about my brother Miguel, who now worked part-time at a grocery store at 70 because Richard had stolen his retirement. I thought about that young couple and their children who had been sleeping in their car for weeks after Richard's fake property deal fell through. "My name is Elena Vasquez," I corrected her. "And yes, I'm prepared to tell you everything." What I didn't know then was that my testimony wouldn't just help convict Richard. It would uncover a web of corruption so deep, so extensive, that by the time it was all over, I would hold the keys to an empire, built on other people's suffering, and that's when I had to make the most important decision of my life. The next 3 weeks changed everything I thought I knew about myself. Ms. Chen had given me her card and told me to call if I remembered anything else, but what she didn't understand was that I remembered everything. 43 years of marriage to a criminal had turned me into an unwitting archivist of his crimes. Every detail I had dismissed as just business suddenly became evidence. Every gut feeling I had ignored became proof. I started with Richard's home office, the room I had been forbidden to enter for decades. "Private business matters," he used to say whenever I got too close to his desk. "Nothing that would interest you, Elena." But now, with him sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial, that office became my archaeological dig site. And what I found buried in his filing cabinets made my blood run cold. Bank statements showing deposits that didn't match any income I knew about. Contracts for properties that existed only on paper. Letters from lawyers representing clients I had never heard him mention. Elderly people, young families, small business owners who had trusted Richard with their life savings. There was Mrs. Chen's retirement fund. Yes, the same Ms. Chen who was prosecuting him. She had invested her teacher's pension with Richard 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that the prosecutor working to convict my husband was also one of his victims. I found records of the Thompsons, the young couple with twin babies who had saved every penny for 5 years to buy their first home. Richard had sold them a house that legally belonged to someone else, then disappeared with their down payment when the real owners showed up. I found correspondence from Mr. Walsh, the veteran who had trusted Richard with his disability benefits to invest in what Richard promised was a sure-thing retirement community. It never existed. Each document I uncovered felt like finding another body in a mass grave. These weren't just financial crimes. They were character assassinations, dream murders, future thefts. And I had been sleeping next to the man responsible every night for decades. But the worst discovery came when I found a folder labeled EV. My initials, Elena Vasquez, the name I had reclaimed just weeks earlier. Inside were documents I had never seen before, papers with my forged signature, applications for loans I never knew existed, credit cards opened in my name that I had never used. I sat there on his expensive leather chair, bought with stolen money, staring at my own signature recreated in Richard's careful handwriting. He had been practicing my name, perfecting it, using it to legitimize his crimes while making me feel like I was nothing more than a burden in his life. The cruelest part wasn't just the identity theft. It was the realization that he had been using my invisibility as a weapon. While he convinced me I was too stupid to understand business matters, he was forging my signature on documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. While he told me I had never contributed anything meaningful to our marriage, He was using my clean credit history and spotless background as collateral for his schemes. I found loan applications where he had listed me as a co-signer for properties I had never seen, never heard of, never agreed to invest in. He had used my social security number to open accounts that funded his fraudulent operations. In the eyes of the federal government, I wasn't just Richard's wife. I was his business partner. The violation felt worse than adultery. At least with his affairs, he was only betraying my heart. With this, he had stolen my entire identity and weaponized it against innocent people. That night, I called Ms. Chen from my kitchen phone, the same phone where I used to order groceries and make appointments for Richard's dry cleaning. But this time, I was calling to destroy him. I found something, I told her. I found everything. The next morning, federal agents arrived at my house, my former house, with boxes and cameras. They photographed every document, every bank statement, every piece of evidence I had uncovered, and I stood there, watching them dismantle the life I had built with a man who had never deserved a single day of my loyalty. I felt like an archaeologist watching experts examine artifacts from a civilization I thought I knew but had never really understood. These agents moved through my home with professional efficiency, cataloging evidence of crimes that had been happening right under my nose for decades. Agent Rodriguez, a kind woman about my daughter's age, sat with me while her team worked. She had gentle eyes and spoke to me like I was a person, not just a witness, something Richard hadn't done in years. "Mrs. Vasquez," she said. I noticed she used my chosen name without me having to correct her. "I want you to know how brave this is. Most spouses in your situation would have looked the other way. But that's where she was wrong. I hadn't looked the other way for 43 years. I had been looking directly at it, collecting it, storing it away like a subconscious insurance policy. Every suspicious transaction, every late-night phone call, every client who left. Our house looking devastated while Richard counted cash in the kitchen. The accountant in me had never really died. She had just been playing the long game. What Agent Rodriguez didn't understand was that women like me, women who had been systematically diminished and dismissed, we become expert observers because survival depends on it. When you can't trust the person you're living with, you learn to trust your instincts. When you're told your thoughts don't matter, you learn to keep detailed mental records. When you're made to feel invisible, you learn to see everything. Over the following days, I worked with the prosecution team to build their case. We went through decades of financial records, connecting dots that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 decades. Richard hadn't just stolen money. He had destroyed lives with the precision of a surgeon and the conscience of a snake. Those sessions in the federal building became my graduate education in forensic accounting. Ms. Chen would spread documents across the conference table like pieces of a puzzle, and I would see patterns that the younger agents missed. I could trace Richard's money laundering schemes through multiple shell companies, identify forged signatures, spot the telltale signs of fraudulent contracts. "Look at this," I would say, pointing to a bank transfer that seemed routine to everyone else. "This deposit happens every third Thursday, always for amounts ending in 37. Richard, superstitious about the number 37. It's his mother's birthday. He's trying to make random transactions look legitimate by following his own psychological pattern." The agents would stare at me like I had just performed magic, but it wasn't magic at all. It was 43 years of marriage to a man whose habits I knew better than my own. During one particularly long session, Agent Rodriguez looked up from a stack of property deeds and asked, "Mrs. Vasquez, how did you survive living with this level of deception for so long?" I paused, considering her question. How do you explain to someone that you can love a person and simultaneously collect evidence against them? How do you describe the cognitive dissonance of cooking dinner for a monster while mentally cataloging his crimes? "Agent Rodriguez," I finally said, "when you're married to someone who makes you feel crazy, you start keeping your own version of events just to stay sane. I wasn't trying to build a case against him. I was trying to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. She nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. You were documenting your own reality. Exactly. And it turns out my reality was more accurate than his lies. But here's what I discovered about myself during those long days in conference rooms, surrounded by evidence of my husband's cruelty. I was good at this. Better than good. I understood financial fraud better than some of the junior prosecutors on the team. Those 2 years of accounting courses from 1979 weren't wasted after all. It was like discovering a muscle I forgot I had. Every spreadsheet I analyzed, every discrepancy I caught, every pattern I identified, it felt like coming back to life after decades of being half dead. The woman who used to balance checkbooks in her head while grocery shopping, who could spot a pricing error from across a store, who had once dreamed of having her own accounting practice, she was still there, sharper than ever. You should have been a forensic accountant, Ms. Chen told me one afternoon as we traced Richard's money laundering scheme through a maze of shell companies. You have an eye for patterns most people miss. Should have been. Those words hit me like a physical blow, because they represented all the paths I had never taken, all the dreams I had buried to support a man who was using my sacrifice to hurt other people. But instead of dwelling on what could have been, I felt something unexpected. Excitement. At 71 years old, I was discovering I had talents I had never been allowed to explore. The young agents on the team started coming to me with questions. Mrs. Vasquez, does this transaction look normal to you? Mrs. Vasquez, what do you think this code means? Mrs. Vasquez, how would you hide money if you were Richard? That last question stopped me cold. How would I hide money if I were Richard? The answer came to me immediately, and it terrified me how easily I could think like him. Jewelry, I said quietly. He would convert cash to jewelry and hide it somewhere safe, something that holds value, doesn't show up on bank records, and can be moved easily. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. Do you know where he might keep something like that? I thought about our house, about all the places Richard thought were secret but weren't. Check the safety deposit box at First National, the one he thinks I don't know about, box 247, and look for a loose floorboard in our bedroom closet, behind the winter coats. 3 hours later, Agent Rodriguez called me with the results. They had found over $400,000 worth of jewelry and gold coins, plus documents showing 2 more offshore accounts we hadn't discovered yet. As the investigation deepened, I began to understand the true scope of Richard's operation. This wasn't just a man who got greedy and made some bad choices. This was a predator who had systematically targeted the most vulnerable people in our community: recent widows, struggling families, elderly retirees, immigrants who didn't fully understand the language of contracts and investments. The most heartbreaking discovery came when we found his target list, a handwritten notebook where he had cataloged potential victims based on their vulnerabilities. Mrs. Patterson, husband died last year, life insurance payout, trusting nature. The Morettis, language barrier, cash business, no financial advisor. Tom Williams, recent divorce, desperate to rebuild, prideful. He had hunted these people like prey, and I had been cooking his meals while he planned their destruction. But now I was the one with the hunting instincts, and my prey was the man who had underestimated me for 43 years. If you're following my story and wondering how a 71-year-old woman finds the strength to bring down the man who controlled her life for decades, let me tell you something. It starts with realizing that your silence has been protecting the wrong person. As the trial date approached, Richard's lawyer tried everything to discredit me. They painted me as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, a woman scorned who would say anything to hurt her former husband. But they underestimated something crucial about quiet women like me. We remember everything, and we have receipts. The preliminary hearing was set for a Friday morning in October. Richard would be there in shackles listening as I testified about every crime he had committed while I served him dinner and ironed his shirts. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Power. Real, genuine power. That came from finally using my voice for something that mattered. But I also knew that testifying was just the beginning, because what the prosecution team had discovered during their investigation was bigger than even I had imagined. And it was about to make me the wealthiest woman I had ever dreamed of becoming. The morning of Richard's trial, I woke up at 5 a.m. without an alarm. My body knew what day it was, what I was about to do. I made myself coffee in the quiet kitchen, my kitchen now, and sat at the table where I had eaten thousands of meals with a man who had been lying to me since our wedding day. When I walked into that federal courtroom at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing a simple navy dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Complete certainty about who I was and what I was meant to do. Richard looked different in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow. His perfect hair was disheveled, his face pale and drawn. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I had never seen before in 43 years of marriage. Fear. He was afraid of me. Good. He should be. The prosecution calls Elena Vasquez to the stand. Walking to that witness stand felt like walking toward my own rebirth. My legs were steady, my voice was clear, and for the first time in my adult life, every eye in the room was focused on me, not because I was someone's wife, but because I was someone important in my own right. Mrs. Vasquez, Ms. Chen began gently. Please tell the court how long you were married to the defendant. 43 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. 43 years during which I believed I was married to a successful businessman. I was wrong. I was married to a predator. I heard Richard's sharp intake of breath, but I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the jury, 12 faces that represented every person Richard had ever hurt. For the next 2 hours, I laid out the evidence methodically, like the accountant I should have been all along. I described finding the forged documents, the hidden accounts, the victims whose lives had been destroyed while I served Richard dinner, and asked about his day. Mrs. Vasquez, the defense attorney tried during cross-examination. Isn't it true that you lived a comfortable life funded by these alleged crimes? That you enjoyed the benefits of your husband's creative business practices? I had been waiting for this question. I turned to face the jury directly. Sir, I lived comfortably the same way a kidnapping victim might live comfortably in a golden cage. Yes, I had nice things. Yes, we lived in a beautiful house. But I paid for that comfort with my identity, my dreams, and 43 years of my life. And I had no idea that every piece of jewelry, every vacation, every comfortable meal was bought with someone else's stolen future. The defense attorney sat down. He had no more questions, but I wasn't finished. I had one more thing to say, something I had been rehearsing for weeks. Your Honor, if I may address the court directly? Judge Martinez nodded. I stood up in that witness box, all 5 feet 2 inches of me, and I spoke with a voice that had been silent for too long. Richard Castellanos spent decades convincing me I was worthless, that I contributed nothing to our marriage, that I was too stupid to understand his business. But sitting in this courtroom today, I realize he was right about one thing. I never understood his business, because his business was built on destroying families, stealing dreams, and preying on trust. That's a business I could never understand, because I'm not a sociopath. The courtroom was absolutely silent. But what he was wrong about was my value, because the woman he called worthless just handed the federal government the evidence needed to convict him and recover millions of dollars for his victims. The woman he said contributed nothing to our marriage, just contributed to justice being served. When I stepped down from that witness stand, I felt like I was stepping into a completely new life. Judge Martinez deliberated for less than 30 minutes. When she returned, her face was stern as granite. Richard Castellanos, this court finds you guilty on all counts of fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Richard's legs gave out. His Lawyer had to help him stay standing. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, under federal asset forfeiture laws, all properties, accounts, and assets obtained through criminal enterprise are to be seized by the government for victim restitution. However, she paused, looking directly at me. Mrs. Elena Vasquez has been determined to be an innocent spouse under federal law. As such, she is entitled to 50% of all recovered assets, as well as full ownership of any legitimate marital property. The numbers Ms. Chen whispered to me later made my head spin. Richard's criminal enterprise had netted over $18 million across 2 decades. The house, the cars, the business, everything legitimate that I had helped build during our marriage, was mine. Everything stolen would go back to his victims. But I would walk away with over $9 million. As they led Richard away in shackles, he looked back at me one last time. His mouth was moving like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. I had found my voice. He had lost his. And that's when I realized the most beautiful truth of all. This wasn't the end of Richard's story, affecting my life. This was the beginning of my story, with me as the author for the first time in 7 decades. That was 2 years ago, and I'm writing this story from my new apartment overlooking Central Park, a place I chose not for its luxury, but for its view of endless possibilities. Let me tell you what a 73-year-old woman does with $9 million and a lifetime of suppressed dreams. First, I did something Richard would have called wasteful. I gave away almost half of it. I created the Elena Vasquez Victim Recovery Fund, specifically designed to help people rebuild their lives after financial fraud. Mrs. Henderson got her house back. My brother Miguel retired with dignity. The Thompson family with the twin babies finally got their dream home. A real one this time, with a deed that can't be disputed. Every check I signed felt like an act of rebellion against the woman I used to be, the one who never believed she had the right to make important decisions. With the remaining money, I did something even more radical. I went back to school. At 71 years old, I enrolled in a forensic accounting program at Columbia University. My classmates could have been my grandchildren, but they treated me like a peer when they realized I knew more about financial fraud than some of their professors. Mrs. Vasquez, my instructor said after I presented my final project, a comprehensive analysis of Richard's criminal network, have you considered consulting me? Work? The FBI could use someone with your expertise and intuitive understanding of white-collar criminals. Could use someone with my expertise. At 73, I was finally being valued for my mind, instead of dismissed because of my age or gender. I now work as a freelance consultant for federal law enforcement, helping them understand the psychology of financial predators. I've testified in 12 cases, helped recover over $30 million for victims, and trained young agents to recognize the patterns I spent decades unconsciously cataloging. But perhaps the most satisfying part of my new life isn't the work or the money. It's the woman I see in the mirror every morning. She has gray hair and laugh lines and hands that show her age, but her eyes are bright with purpose. She speaks with authority earned through pain and wisdom, distilled from years of silence. Last month, I received a letter from a woman named Carmen in Texas. Her husband had been stealing her identity for 15 years, using her name to fund gambling debts and fraudulent business ventures. She had found my story online and wrote to ask if it was really possible for a woman her age, 68, to start over. I called her that same day. Carmen, I told her, starting over isn't about how many years you have left. It's about how many years you're willing to live as yourself instead of as someone else's shadow. 3 weeks later, she filed for divorce and contacted the FBI about her husband's crimes. You see, Richard thought he was discarding dead weight when he signed those divorce papers with such satisfaction. But what he actually did was set free a woman who had been gathering strength in silence for 43 years. He thought he was writing the ending to our story. Instead, he was giving me permission to write my own beginning. I keep a photo on my desk from my college graduation last year. Yes, I went back and finished that accounting degree at 72. In the picture, I'm wearing a cap and gown, surrounded by young people who could be my grandchildren, and I'm smiling with a joy I never experienced during my first attempt at college in 1979. The difference is simple. In 1979, I was studying to become someone Richard would approve of. In 2023, I was studying to become someone I could respect. People ask me if I'm angry about the years I lost, the dreams I deferred, the woman I could have been if I had left Richard decades earlier. But here's what I've learned about regret. It's a luxury I can't afford. Every year I spent in that marriage, every moment I spent doubting myself, every dream I put on hold, all of it led me to this moment, sitting in this beautiful apartment, writing this story for women who might need to hear it. My name is Elena Vasquez, and at 73, I'm finally living the life I was always meant to live. If you're reading this and recognizing pieces of your own story in mine, if you're wondering whether it's too late to reclaim your voice, your dreams, your authentic self, let me be the one to tell you. It's never too late to stop being who others expect you to be and start being who you actually are. Richard is serving his sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. I don't think about him much anymore, except when his story serves as a cautionary tale in my consulting work. But sometimes, when I'm testifying in court or teaching young agents or helping another woman find her strength, I think about that morning in the courthouse when he was laughing while signing our divorce papers. He thought he was having the last laugh. He had no idea he was giving me mine. And my laugh. It echoes with the joy of a woman who finally understands her own worth, who refuses to be invisible, who knows that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. The best stories don't end with the bad guy getting punished. They end with the hero discovering they were never actually a victim. They were always the protagonist, just waiting for their moment to step into the light. This is my moment, and if you're reading this, maybe it's yours too.